Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, this shit is pretty intense right here. Oh shit. Oh shit. Wait, what? Man. This shit is fucking silly.
You will protect him from your friends, from the monsters.
He'll be safe. I promise.
Lies.
No.
No!
No. No.
Everything's
What?
gonna be alright. Don't move, Chabaco.
It's okay, Danny.
Don't talk.
You smell that? That's the stink of fucking victory!
Juan,
God
he
damn.
shot Diego in the fucking chest.
Oh, you got
Man shot his own son.
the kid,
Fuck you, he's bleeding
That's
Hit in the heart, Danny. Is he breathing?
out. Lucky, I don't
That's
know.
crazy,
Too much
man.
blood.
Don't move, Danny. We're coming up.
Come on, Diego. Stay with me, Chamaco.
that's fucking nuts.
It's okay. It's okay, Danny. You were the lucky one.
No.
Oh damn. I was not expecting that. I really wasn't.
Move, Danny.
Far Cry 6 was developed and published by Ubisoft, and this is a game that came out to mild reviews. The reviews weren't bad as much as they were just, pretty standard. There weren't too many publications out there giving this game high praise, and for obvious reason. This is, well above the sixth entry in the Far Cry series, and yeah, not much is actually new or different with this one. Of course, the reason for that being is Ubisoft is not really trying anymore, and all they're concerned about is regurgitating, recycling the same formula. So that's why I was skeptical of making a retrospective on this, but I wouldn't feel right if I didn't make a video on this game. So I'm just going to dive right into it. So one of the reasons I was personally interested in picking this game up is because of the narrative. It seemed like the narrative for this game was actually going to be, somewhat decent at the very least. The reason for that, I guess, primarily is because they got a fantastic actor to play the main villain in this game, which is Giancarlo Esposito, who is most known for playing the role of Gus on Breaking Bad, among other roles recently, including a role that he's had in The Mandalorian. I'm actually quite a fan of some of the things that he's done in the film industry, so the fact that Giancarlo Esposito has joined the list of all these other celebrities that are now starting to embrace, video game roles, I really wanted to see, personally, what they did with his character and where they were going to go with it. And for the most part, the game does not disappoint. The primary big bad, Anton Castillo, portrayed by, once again, veteran voice actor Giancarlo Esposito, as well as his son Diego, have some of the best moments in both this game and the series as a whole. These characters right here, these two characters, they're extremely well written. The main thing that I like about the Anton Castillo character is the fact that he's ruthless, like the other Far Cry villains from past games in the series. But what's different about him is that he coaches his son throughout the game in an attempt to make Diego more like him. And this is where I was most curious with the narrative. I was wondering exactly where the story was going to go and what was going to happen to Diego primarily. So with that said, I was disappointed at the end of the game when Anton killed Diego. Although I understand why he did it, I just feel like Diego, his part in the story was basically wasted. especially considering throughout the game it's emphasized that Diego is not like his father and that they're actually two very different people. And I wanted to see more of what was going to happen with the Diego character, but I feel like they didn't really do enough with his character. And the same goes for Esposito's Castillo. While Anton Castillo and his son Diego are great characters, unfortunately they are barely seen throughout the course of the game's runtime. Instead, the game places more of an emphasis on the actual rebels throughout the game. And in this game, you play as a rebel named Danny Rojas. And once again, Ubisoft gives you the option to play either as a male or a female. Although the canon story is obviously the woman, the female version of Danny Rojas, which is the version that I chose to play. Danny Rojas is, within of herself, a very likable character. She's a former military veteran turned mercenary, and she has a lot of connections in the fictional world of Yara, which is basically these large series of tropical islands, which is where Far Cry 6 takes place. And along with Danny, there's a lot of different characters that you come across throughout the game that you interact with. And the side and supporting characters are just as well written as Danny and Anton and Diego. All of the rebels have their own reasons for fighting for the resistance and their own reasons for wanting to take down Anton in their quest to liberate Yara. This is what sets Far Cry 6 apart narratively from the older games in the series. There's more of a connection with the side and supporting characters than there has been in past titles. Games like Far Cry 4 and Far Cry 5 place more of an emphasis either on the main character or the villain in order to elaborate on the story. But Far Cry 6, by comparison, takes pleasure in emphasizing the supporting characters that you actually meet and interact with throughout the course of the game's runtime. As a result, while I didn't necessarily get the story, the particular story that I wanted from Far Cry 6, I didn't walk away from this game hating the story. I just felt that the story was a bit too straightforward, and there was potential there to do more with, the narrative. And the narrative itself, I felt, had more potential than what they actually chose to do. Regarding the pros for Far Cry 6, the game features stellar art direction. The world is beautifully realized from the island regions of Madrugada and Libertad to the constricted militarized zone of El Este and so forth. There's a lot of diverse locations in this game, and unlike Far Cry 5, which featured a very boring setting and also featured an equally boring wildlife, this game doesn't suffer the same fate as its predecessor. There's quite a few interesting predators that lurk and roam around Yara as you're exploring the open world, including wolves, sharks, horses, and no matter where you go, the world always feels like it's populated in the appropriate way that it should. And of course, going back to the supporting characters, there's plenty of likable characters, specifically from the Legends to the Libertad rebel leaders. While some characters are too on the nose with their stereotypes, they each help keep the story engaging whenever a cutscene is showcased. This also plays the same for the side quests. The side quests remain interesting enough to where I was able to look past some of the more mundane tasks that devolve into, your typical fetch quest design. And of course, a lot of this had to do with the way the characters are written. This is another perfect example of how solid writing can actually help elevate gameplay in the video game. The entertaining aspects of the Far Cry experience make a return here, including the wingsuit, airplanes, helicopters, races, treasure hunts, and guerrilla-style stealth and firefights. Everything that the Far Cry series has built its name off of is present in this game, for better or worse. The better part being that there's not anything from the older games that's missing here, that you actually want to be in here, that you expect to be in the Far Cry game. The worst part being that those elements really don't drastically change the overall formula enough. But I'll get to all of that. There's plenty of weapon variety this time around, with a placed emphasis on the uncanny valley with creative and unique weapons with gimmicks that power their place in the player's arsenal. So you do have some gimmick weapons in this game. For example, you have this backpack thing that can serve as several different functions, and you can use it to attack enemies. The standard variation of this machinery comes in the form of a portable rocket launcher that can fire multiple rockets at a specific target. This is especially useful against airborne enemies that take aim at you from the sky in helicopters and airplanes. And the weapon was so effective that I decided to basically stick with the default throughout the entire game, although I did experiment a little bit. And of course, you have your typical categories with your machine guns, your rifles, your submachine guns, your shotguns, your sniper rifles, so on and so forth. Once you find a particular weapon that's unique, the game does reward you for sticking with that weapon as they're extremely effective in combat. Regarding structures in the open world, Strongholds do return here in the form of bases, and once again, they remain entertaining despite the formula having gone a bit stale. I never really got bored or tired or frustrated tackling a stronghold in this game, and they have plenty of strongholds in Far Cry 6, but not too many to the point where I felt that it was like an Assassin's Creed Odyssey sort of thing and they just went overboard and just, copy and pasted the same stronghold 100 dozen times. The map is littered with various activities for the player to tackle, and while those activities are very reminiscent of activities from older titles, and you will find yourself repeating the same thing over and over again, including attacking checkpoints and strongholds, as well as blowing up anti-aircraft guns, among other things, the story does a good job of breaking up those mundane tasks, and the gameplay does remain interesting enough to where it's not really that big of a deal in terms of repetition. This game also did something a bit strange, which not everyone felt that this was a good change, but this has more of an RPG feel than the older Far Cry games. The enemies all have health bars above their heads and whatnot, and there is a leveling progression system in the game as well. Naturally, some players felt that this game just placed an emphasis on the enemies becoming damage sponges due to the incorporation of a progression system that's very RPG-like. I didn't really feel that this was the case because the game still encourages the player to go for headshots in the middle of combat, and the way Ubisoft designs their shooting mechanics, it's very easy and simple to pull off headshots in this game. Essentially, the mechanics haven't really changed or been altered too much from older titles in the series. Now, there are some enemies or whatever that wear armor, especially towards the midpoint of the story leading all the way through to the end of the game, but you can switch out your ballistics for your ammunition type, and the game developers did include the ability for the player to use armor-piercing rounds, which is obviously very effective against heavily armored enemies. So even though the progression system is there, it really doesn't come as a detriment to the gameplay itself. This is still the same Far Cry experience that everyone has come to know at this point. Now going into the cons, the Far Cry formula, better known as the worn-out Ubisoft formula, has definitely run its course. While there is much to see and experience, very little has changed from Far Cry 5 to this more recent entry. So basically, the way you engage in combat is essentially the same. The way you tackle side activities, side missions, various quests throughout the game, all of it is basically essentially the same. The way you navigate the environment is basically the same. You can climb things, you can swim, you can parachute, you can drive various vehicles by land, by sea, and in the air. And they added a mechanic where you can load a fast travel point and skydive your way to wherever it is you're trying to go, which made navigation not only more fun, but a lot less time consuming. I found myself using the skydiving feature more frequently throughout my playthrough. Now, the emphasis on co-op, which Far Cry 5 placed a great focus on, has basically been replaced by a companion system The companions being, various pets and other animals that can accompany you throughout the game. You start out with a pet crocodile that will follow you throughout the game and attack enemies on sight as soon as you engage in combat. There's also a puppy that's bound to like a stroller, and they have some other ones in the game as well. The companion system really doesn't add much variety to the gameplay, and the companions themselves serve as nothing more than mindless distractions for the brainless enemy AI in combat. Out of everything that I hated about Far Cry 5, because Far Cry 5 admittedly is one of the worst entries in the series, I know there are people out there that really love Far Cry 5 and think that Far Cry 5 is actually one of the better games in the series. It's not at all. But one of the things that I really did enjoy from Far Cry 5, one of the very few things that I actually liked about that game, was the emphasis on co-op. And as big as these Far Cry games are, I didn't mind that there was an AI co-op companion that assisted me throughout my game in Far Cry 5. By comparison, the companion system just doesn't measure up. And I feel that ultimately the companion system definitely is not a good or suitable or worthy replacement for the co-op features that was featured in Far Cry 5. Probably the biggest issue that I have is the enemy AI. The enemy AI in this game is grossly incompetent, often failing to deliver a relevant challenge even on the game's highest difficulty setting.
Found you! Dios mío! Over there, go!
This is due in part to the extremely forgiving healing system, which is based on a cooldown timer. So with this game, you essentially have two separate difficulty levels, which is basically easy and normal. They have actual name designations for the difficulty modes in this game, but I'm just going to call it easy and normal because that's what it is. There essentially is no hard mode in this game, which doesn't bother me, but at the same time, the game really isn't challenging the way I feel that it should. And that's because the healing system is just way too forgiving. It's extremely easy to just run around a corner when you're on the brink of dying and just waiting it out until the game allows you to heal back to full health. And then after that, you can just go and engage the enemy again. And the AI, unfortunately, is too fucking stupid to actually, defend themselves in an adequate manner. It's very clear that Ubisoft just said screw it and didn't even really try to put a legitimate challenge in the game. Instead, placing more of a focus on, the game's side activities and scope of the open world. While we have other games coming out, such as Halo Infinite, for example, that's probably going to address this issue, it would have been nice if Ubisoft actually cared enough to give a shit to actually make the game a proper challenge. But alas, of course not. And then the final thing is the story, while well written, has a very narrow and straightforward ending that offers virtually no lasting thoughts or questions after the credits have rolled. A clear waste of potential given the game's political overtones. Now, as I mentioned before, I was pretty disappointed with the ending to this game, and I know there is a separate ending. There's like a secret ending or whatever that you can unlock, but the primary base standard ending for this game, I felt was just anticlimactic. Basically, at the end of the game, Anton Castillo is just overrun. He basically sacrifices himself and his son, and the rebels win, and then the credits basically just roll. They have like one ending cutscene, and it really doesn't add much of anything to the plot based off of everything that happened earlier in the game. In fact, I was actually surprised with this game because the story is actually one of the shorter narratives in the Far Cry series as a whole, which is definitely something that surprised me. I was expecting a longer experience. Although I'm glad that Ubisoft didn't make a longer game, I feel that this game is long enough, and they didn't go overboard, nor did they make something that was too short. I felt that the story itself, once again, had more potential, and they didn't really do much to actually utilize the characters that they've created in the best way possible. And since the DLC has already been announced for this game, with one DLC pack having already been released at this point, it's clear that the DLC is not going to address some of the downsides to the narrative in Far Cry 6. At the end of the day, Far Cry 6 is a very straightforward, run-of-the-mill Far Cry experience. It doesn't do anything to undercut what players have come to expect from this series, but it also doesn't do enough to actually move the series forward and evolve old and tired gameplay mechanics and systems that the series has been throwing around for years now. And I can't imagine anyone that played this game, or if one hasn't played Far Cry 6, if there's people out there that haven't gotten to experience this game yet, I can't imagine that this is really going to change their mind, if they already have made up in their mind as to what a Far Cry game is and should be. This game is definitely not going to change anyone's mind. It's literally the most play-it-safe game that's been released in 2021. The question, though, remains, would you rather invest in a game that plays it safe and sticks to what it does well, or would you rather invest in a game that actually takes some risks with the potential that it might actually stumble? Well, that question is up to the individual. As for me, this was an okay game. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. It's okay. But if I'm going to continue to invest in this series, I'm definitely going to need something a bit more. Unfortunately, Ubisoft has basically already confirmed that the next Far Cry game is basically going to be a live service title, which doesn't surprise me at all, and definitely does not make me excited in anticipation for Far Cry 7. So this very well may be the final game I play in this franchise, at least for quite some time. And only time will tell to see where Ubisoft is going to go with this series.
The